Welcome to my podcast is episode number 6, a video podcast where we speak to important artists from the performing arts world and ask them how they deal with the big problems of our time that concern us all. Well, you might be surprised by the backdrop here today, but to be honest, I'm about to move and there are such messy backgrounds here in my apartment. So I prefer to give you a real nice background, which is here, Vienna State Opera. And we are talking about opera to a real opera man today. So I thought this backdrop might be just appropriate. My guest here today is David Pountney. David, who is one of the most important opera directors and opera people in general in the world today. He has worked and practiced his art all over the place, not just in Europe and the United Kingdom, in North America, in South America, and Australia, everywhere. And he was also general and artistic director of the Bregenz Festival for quite some time. He is really somebody who knows the opera world upside down, who has strong opinions, and it has been a pleasure to talk to him. We are not only going to talk about the pandemic today, of course, that's also a big part of our discussion. We are also touching on another subject that really is of concern to many European and British artists in particular, but I think to the arts world in general, which is the consequences of Brexit on the arts world and the artists. So David, being British himself, he knows what he's talking about and he has also quite clear opinions on that. So without much further ado, I'm happy to have you here with us again today, and let's go and meet David Pountney in his nice house in Burgundy, where I spoke to him a few days ago, and I'm really looking forward to present you this nice interview. Enjoy. It's a pleasure for me to welcome today David Pountney here on the screens and microphones of my podcast. David, it's been quite a time that we didn't speak, and I'm glad to have you here. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening, and it's a pleasure to speak to you again, too.
Thank you. Well, David, the reason why we meet here is, of course, that our audience here is always pleased to hear that artists and how artists deal with subjects that is also a bit apart from the usual things that you read and hear from artists, but real life concerns that we as artists have, and how we think about them, how we also treat them, and how we deal with them. And of course, the pandemic has been in the center of much discussion lately, and we should also talk about that a bit. And maybe we should start about that. But we have another topic after this, which we would also like to touch, and we'll come to that maybe in a few minutes. But let me just first ask you, as an artist and also as a person, as a human being, how are you dealing with this whole pandemic situation? How does it affect you beyond the problematic non-work situation that artists are all in now? What does it mean to you?
Well, I would say, first of all, it meant a gigantic disappointment in the fact that I've actually in my life begun work on the ring cycle 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
First time was in Australia, where we designed all about 2/3 of the ring, I would say, and the project was cancelled for internal political reasons.
Mm.
We started work on a ring at the ENO in the 1980s and did a Valkyrie, but then for reasons not connected with the production itself, that had to be abandoned. So when Chicago rang me and said, "Would you like to do a ring cycle?" I said, "Yes, I really would, and this better be third time lucky," because I've had 2 run into the sand. And in Chicago, we did Rheingold, we did Valkyrie, we did Siegfried, and
When
we
was
were
that?
really sorry.
When was that? The Siegfried, when did that finish?
So it was meant to open in 2020. So we
Mm.
started in 2018 with Rheingold, 2019 uh, Valkyrie, 2020 Siegfried, and 2020 was also supposed to be Götterdämmerung and the
Okay.
Cycles.
Mm.
And we were about pretty much ready to go on stage, actually, with Götterdämmerung when this whole thing struck.
Mm.
So that was in itself a gigantic project which remains unfulfilled, which was a
Mhm.
huge disappointment. As it so happened, actually, 2020 was, I would say, possibly a kind of climactic year in my career as a
Mhm.
director, because I had this project and several other very important projects. Um, and so, I feel as though something very vital and essential has been stripped away from me. And I don't think it's very realistic to expect that the ring can be remounted. A lot of things, of course,
Mm.
have been postponed and kicked into forward years, which will in time be very nice, of course, to do those. But for the Chicago Opera, the investment in preparing a ring is something so huge, and the losses that they've sustained as a result of COVID are so huge that it's very difficult to imagine that they're going to be able to stitch that back together
Mhm.
um, in the next 3, 4, 5 years. I don't know. It's a pretty bleak prospect.
I'm sure. I mean, we speak about America here, and you have been working on not only both sides of the Atlantic, but even down under, as you just said. But being British yourself, do you think that we have this situation on the continent where theatres more or less are trying to survive by public subsidy? Then we have the American situation, which is of course completely different economically in that very moment. How is the British situation? Is it an in between, or is there more hope for survival of smaller companies in Britain than in the US? Or how do you see that?
Well, I think that um, the support for culture in Britain has never been so solid as it is in
Mm,
Europe,
sure.
and culture is just simply not given the kind of mainstream support. Not so, I'm not really talking so much about the government here. I'm talking also about the public.
Okay.
There is a sense in Europe, which I feel very strongly, because I've worked a lot in Europe, obviously,
Of
um,
course.
that that people really feel that they own their local theatres and their opera companies and their orchestras, and that it's part of their regular social life and it's something deeply, deeply embedded.
Mhm.
Uh, in the UK, it's always been a bit of an add-on,
Mhm.
and not in the same way essential as I think it can be described as, particularly in a city like Vienna, where you're speaking from,
Sure.
where it's something so essential and central to everybody's understanding of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a society, and that society goes to the theatre and shares their emotional and intellectual and, yeah, physical experiences. Um, and that sense, that deep sense of participation, is not something we've ever achieved in the United Kingdom.
Mhm.
The situation in the United States is really, really different. I listened to Peter Gelb, the director of the Met, on giving a long interview on France Musique just recently,
Mhm.
in which he described the situation where he is basically firing his chorus and orchestra.
Mm.
And he continued to repeat during this broadcast the lie, actually, that culture is not supported by the government in the United States. This is an absolute nonsense.
Mm.
In the United States, people who give money to culture are entitled to claim a tax rebate on the money that they give. What that means is essentially is that money that would otherwise be government revenue is diverted by the hand of the donor to the cultural area. And this is a subsidy.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
just a
Yeah.
subsidy organized in a different way. The subsidy is distributed not by the government, as in Vienna or even in the
Hmm.
UK. It's distributed by the individual donor, but it's still a distribution of government money. And
Absolutely.
actually, I've never done the maths. I'd be very interested if somebody has done the maths to determine how large that government subsidy is in the United States, which is
Hmm.
distributed by the donors. But I
Yeah,
guess it's really quite large. I would
it
be
is substantial, I'm
surprised.
sure. Yes,
I would be
absolutely.
surprised if it was very much less than. I mean, most
Hmm.
European governments give more or less 1% of GDP to the arts. That's a kind of.
Absolutely.
In Germany, it's a little bit more. In
Yeah,
some countries, it's a little bit less. In the UK, it's a little bit less. But that's a pretty standard formula.
yeah.
And the other interesting thing about the American case is that there has been an extraordinary upsurge of operatic creativity in the United States.
Yes.
And the guy who runs Opera America, which is the sort of umbrella body which looks after American opera companies, represents American opera companies, told me that aside from the sort of 10 top titles, Magic Flute, Aida, Carmen,
Mm.
all that, that
Yeah.
that list,
Hmm.
apart from those very, very, very popular titles, the next best-selling category of opera performances in the United States are new American operas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of these have been created with very specific communities in mind and very often telling
Hmm.
stories that relate to local communities. But they're very serious operas. I mean,
Hmm.
they're not kind of what we might call community operas in the sense that no,
Yeah.
they're serious pieces of work.
Yeah.
And there's been a huge explosion of that. And that's an interesting lesson, actually, I think, for all of us, that the American operas have focused on telling stories that are genuinely relevant to an American public, and the American public has tended to respond to that very enthusiastically. Now we have the curious sort of question that the music of these pieces is actually, I think, invariably extremely skillful. Um, I mean, it's very professionally made and is looked upon with complete disdain and contempt within the European area.
It has been for 30 years or even
Yeah, at
more, hasn't
least,
it?
yeah,
Yes. Yes.
because they see this music as being something that is sort of easy listening or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so there is a very interesting divide there, and I think that I think the Americans have got quite a lot right in this particular area
Hmm. Hmm.
because they've embraced creating operas that genuinely speak to the public that they have and is not part of some kind of dutiful academic modernism,
Yeah.
which I feel is a tremendous blight on the European musical scene.
Yes, definitely. And the arrogance which is looked at some point from Europe, still at this moment, is quite amazing. But do you think that the pandemic and what it means to the arts will have different outcomes exactly on that very topic that you are touching here? Do you think that those operas, like they are produced, contemporary operas like they're produced in the US, will have an easier life to survive than the European system. What's your thought on that?
It's impossible to call. I mean, I think that I mean, I actually was stupid enough to start a little tiny company in the middle of all this,
Did it?
dedicated to nurturing and developing new works called Creative Juices,
Hmm.
and I found it incredibly difficult to raise money for this project, even though I'm going to people who've supported me and who I know very well, and because at this moment everybody is focused on propping up the existing institutions.
Hmm.
And this may well not be a very wise choice,
Yeah.
actually. I
Yes.
mean, there is something apocalyptic maybe about suggesting this, but I sort of almost see this COVID thing as a kind of cleaning of the stables. Let's not prop up stuff that's just sort of going on, doing the same old thing and producing a rather tiresome, limited repertoire of pieces, and saying we have to do this because we have to fill our house. Well, now you see they're not even allowed to fill their house.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
now would be the moment to do
Would be a
something really
chance. Yeah.
interesting and say,
Yes.
right, we can take a risk. We're not allowed to sell the whole house, so let's sell half the house and do something twice as interesting.
And
On the
nobody will blame you
whole,
if you've only got 500 people in the hall because you aren't allowed to have more anyways. So.
exactly. But on the whole, one is greeted by, I think, a sense of paralysis
Mm. Yes,
on the part of
probably.
the large institutions that are desperate to kind of safeguard their existence and
Yeah.
preserve something which maybe shouldn't be preserved. I mean,
Is it the fight of the dinosaurs?
the fight of the dinosaurs, and I think the focus should be to look where creativity is. And
Yeah.
I talked about the American opera scene, and actually, what has been true in Britain until this COVID thing came along was that there was a huge energy of creativity in the
Mm.
opera field, not exclusively attached to the great institutions. Now, as it so happens, the great institutions have had um, also an explosion of very important creativity. If one thinks of George Benjamin and Written on Skin and Thomas
Sure.
Addis, so on
Yeah.
those kind of common garden scale new works, these have appeared in Britain and have gone around the world in a way that has not really happened since the 1930s,
Hmm.
when that many of the newest operas would have immediately 20 or 30 productions around the place.
Yes.
I mean, that hasn't happened to anybody, not even to Benjamin Britten did that happen. But it happened to George Benjamin. I mean, Written on Skin has
Sure.
been done all over the world.
Yes.
But that's the top strata, if you like. Underneath that, way underneath that, there are people producing pieces of music theatre. I mean, I'd call them operas. I didn't care about what you call them really, but telling stories with music in basements and garages and back rooms and little groups of people. And there's an enormous energy in the sector,
Hmm.
which is under the horizon of the main institutions, but
Yes.
is something very important and very vibrant.
Hmm. 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 Let's talk a few minutes also about another subject which has maybe the same kind of impact in a different way. Um, More on Europe, and I mean Europe in that case as a geographical matter and not as a political matter, which is something that I know has also concerned you a lot. And you have been very outspoken about that situation around Brexit. And as far as I know, you have been, now that Brexit has been executed, you have even taken measures, and I think taken on a Polish passport, which was possible for you for some reason. So, but beyond that effect that has for you, what is your thought about the development of the arts world, about the problematic development of the arts world around Brexit and its consequences?
Well, I think, on the banal practical level, um, as we're discovering as a country on all sorts of in all sorts of areas, whether it's a lorry load of shrimps um, or langoustine, particularly from Scotland, which are mostly sold in Europe because we're too stupid to eat them. Um, then they discover this, a huge delay because of the paperwork, and I mean, part of that is, of course, teething problems, and that will get sorted out, I'm sure.
Mm.
But much more seriously, in terms of our discussion, I mean, what happens to young artists or even very established artists is that
And
their
in all
lives
fields,
have
not just the classical arts, but also pop
right,
music, etc. Right? Yeah.
absolutely,
Mm. Mm.
which is uh, huge, thrown in their path huge administrative difficulties
Mm.
of, and then COVID, of course, on top of all that. But even without COVID, I mean, the whole issue of work permits and so on is going to be hugely damaging to young British artists. And young British artists have been a major plus contributive factor in the European art scene because
Also for destinies already, exactly. Yeah.
these are, in terms of singers and so on, these are very well trained people, and they come with a very positive work ethic and a very good attitude, and have been much used by European venues and so on, because they deliver, they're good at their job, and they are going to struggle enormously. Those people coming
Yeah.
out of colleges,
Mhm.
because the inevitable tendency will be for a manager in Wuppertal or wherever who's booking a concert to not choose the person who's going to give him another 10 hours of bureaucratic paperwork to deal with. I
Yes.
mean,
Yes.
it's just going to be a very damaging influence.
But
And
you and I, we are both old enough to have lived practically, also in our professional lives, a time when the UK was not part of any European um, common market, also common work market, so to speak. I remember times when it was hard to get a work permit as a European in the UK and vice versa. Then it, it was made much easier by the EU. Now we return to a situation like beforehand. But it seems to me that now it's it's become worse because we've had the better experience, or is that something I imagine, or do you also feel that it's worse than it was before the EU?
well, we didn't know any better before the EU, and then this dream opened up, not just about
Yeah,
work, but about traveling and just feeling free to move around, which has, of course, suddenly
sure.
also taken a huge blow with this pandemic. I've even had considerable difficulty reaching my own house in Burgundy uh,
Yeah, sure.
during the course of all this.
Mm.
I sort of just going back to the Polish passport, because it's not
Yes.
entirely irrelevant to all this. Um, I was actually at the Bregenz Festival. I mounted the world premiere of an opera by Mstislav Weinberg
Hmm.
called The Passenger, which was an
Yes,
opera about
remember that.
Auschwitz.
Hmm.
And when I discovered this composer um, and realized the incredible quantity of music he'd created, actually working as a Soviet composer throughout all his life, he fled into the Soviet Union when he was
Hmm.
19 and lived the rest of his life there. Um, and I kind of lifted the lid of this sealed box and found all this amazing stuff inside. And we played 23 pieces by Weinberg in that 2010 festival,
Did
including the
you?
premiere of the opera, and
Wow.
symphonies and requiem and chamber music and all kinds of stuff. And
Hmm.
he was a completely forgotten figure in
Yeah.
Poland also. The Poles had
Mm.
even forgotten that they had this major composer. And curiously enough, by a very unfortunate experience, Weinberg actually did visit Poland as part of a delegation of Soviet composers. And the result of that was that he was reviled as being a Soviet toady, a Soviet collaborator.
Oh
And they
God.
even kind of forgot the fact that he was Polish. Anyway,
Mm.
so we kind of set that record straight in Bregenz. And I also then did a piece by another Polish composer called Andrzej Tchaikovsky, who'd also been
Right.
largely forgotten. So I kind of discovered two Polish composers, and they
Hmm.
gave me an honorary citizenship
Oh, right. So it's not
as a
by some past ancestors, but it's really
no, no,
by,
no,
yeah,
neither
okay.
past ancestors nor 100,000 zlotys under the table. Is actually because I did a kind of cultural service, I suppose.
Yeah.
And they gave me this citizenship, and I said, "Okay, great. Can I please have a Polish passport to go with my citizenship?" And we
Of
went
course.
through a whole lot of bureaucratic wrangles
Mm.
and got there. And so I do, and I'm very proud of being a citizen of Europe.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah.
I mean, I think my argument about the European Union has always been that, not to say that the European Union is by any means perfect,
Sure.
and uh, indeed not to say either that the United Kingdom is by any means perfect, but the concept of nationalism and
Yeah.
nationalities um, is not a is not as those people arguing for Brexit would make you believe, a kind of primeval right. In Mozart's time, you could travel all over Europe and you didn't need anything except
Yes.
a laissez-passer, or
Yeah.
there were no such things as borders. And indeed, if you think about it, when when Mozart was traveling, there was no nation state
Exactly.
between the
Mm.
borders of France and the borders of Russia.
Yeah. Yeah.
All those countries that lie in between that huge space, European space, didn't exist then.
Yes.
It was a fragmented picture of bishoprics and principalities and different little pockets, and of course the Austrian Empire, which was itself a kind of collage of different
Yeah.
nations. Uh, uh, and so, that's why Napoleon came unstuck, because he'd never had to deal with a nation
Yeah.
resisting him. And when
Yeah.
he got
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
Russia,
Yeah. Yeah.
he suddenly discovered what it meant for people to actually be passionate about defending their homeland. There were no homelands in between, there were
Mm.
just fragmented political entities. And so, my thing is, I make myself very unpopular by saying this to the Scots too. Um, for goodness sake, let's not have any more tin pot nationalities.
Yeah.
Uh, these problems of that we have in the modern world, for above all, of course, climate change, but even COVID as well.
Mm.
These are not problems that can be dealt with by single states. The only way that we can deal with these problems is by international collaboration, and we desperately need Europe to be a huge force to stand up to China and to the United States and whoever else may come along in between, Russia
India.
not least,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
and defend our values and make those values valued and extended across the world, because
Yeah.
these are important things. So that's my Brexit
Yeah.
speech.
Yeah. Well, sounds like a great, unfortunately, final word already. Um, David, it was as always when I speak to you, and it was always very interesting and exciting and very nice to speak to you as well. Um, Thank you for your time, and let's hope that the crisis also will show its catharsis at some point, and maybe by the way that you described a bit earlier on, that we have to rethink quite a number of things also in the arts world to make them work better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rudy. Thank you.